Hello, myself Dr. BJD Kalyani, working as Associate Professor in the Department of Computer Science and Engineering of Institute of Aeronautical Engineering. In this video, I will discuss regarding software process models. The topic learning outcome is mapping with the course outcome CO1, which is identify the appropriate process model, approaches and techniques to manage a given software development process. In this video, I will discuss regarding what are variety of software development process models, and I will briefly describe about the spiral model, prototype model. So the software process model in software engineering, each and every organization follows a certain framework for the development of the software. So every software engineering organization should describe a unique set of framework activities for the software process it adopts. So a software process model is an abstract representation of the development process. In detail, the activities are depending upon the selected process model. The model specify the stages and the order of the processes. So the objectives of process model is what tasks to be performed by selecting the appropriate process model, what is the input and output for each task, what are the pre and post condition in order to perform each task, the flow of sequence of each task, and it provides the guidance for controlling and coordinating the task to achieve end product and objectives as effectively as possible. And variety of software development process models are available. They are waterfall model, V model, RAD model, prototype model, spiral model, and iterative and incremental model, agile software development. In the last video, I discussed about the waterfall model, V-shaped model and RAD model. So in this video, I will discuss briefly regarding the prototype model, spiral model and iterative and increment model. The prototype model is basically important when the customer is unable to explain the requirement clearly. The prototype software development model is preferred. The prototype model requires that before carrying out the development of actual software, a working prototype of the system should be built. It can visualize a miniature model of the software to be constructed. By visualizing this miniature model, the customer can able to elaborate the requirements more clearly. So a prototype is a toy implementation of the system. So a prototype usually turns out to be a very crude version of the actual system. So possibly exhibiting limited functional capabilities, low reliability and inefficient performance as compared to actual software. Only the abstract features must be represented with the help of the miniature model of the prototype. So the phases of the prototype model is the requirement gathering, the initial stage, and here the quick design must be done. So prototype development is done during this phase, and this prototype design is an iterative or evolutionary approach. So it is in a loop of two sub-phases: refine requirement, incorporation, customizations, and building the prototype. If the customer is satisfied with the design prototype, the customer evaluation of prototype can be carried out, assessment by the customer, design of the actual software system, implementation, testing and maintenance. So these are the basic phases of the prototype model. Few of the activities must be carried out in a sequence and few phases must be carried out in an evolutionary or iterative approach. So the steps of prototype model are requirement gathering and analysis by the analyst and quick decision, build a prototype, assessment or user evaluation, prototype refinement in any product. So the first step in the prototype building is requirement gathering and analysis. So in this phase, users are asked about what they expect, what they want from the system. So the project scope, the project objective, project goals are clearly defined in this phase. Second step is quick design. So based on the gathered requirement of the step 1, the model is built. This model covers the basic design of the requirement through which a quick overview can be easily described. So the abstract features of the system is modeled with a miniature model or toy implementation of the actual software. So here a lot of case tools and UML diagrams are help for the quick designing. And based on this, building a prototype, this step helps in building actual prototype from the knowledge gained from the prototype design. So generally the popular software for building prototype is the Figma, with which the customer can explain the gathered features, gathered requirement, how they can be solved, can be modeled. By using this, the customer can gain an visualization regarding the actual software development. So, but user evaluation is an iterative approach. So, here first the customer feedback after developing the prototype, it can be exhibited or demonstrated to the customer by taking the customer feedback that is used to develop or refine the constructed prototype. And this prototype is used for testing the prototype by the customer. So this, the output of testing is the resulted information again for which the customer feedback must be taken. It's an iterative approach until customer satisfied with the developed prototype. This iteration must be continued. The next step in the prototype is initial user evaluation. So this step describes the preliminary testing where the investigation of the performance model occurs, as the customer will tell the strength and weakness of the design. So the basic constraints whatever that are developed in the prototype, the weakness and strength of this developed prototype is given by the customer as an initial user evaluation, which is sent to the developer for refinement. The next step is refining the prototype. So based on the output of the step 4, by the taking feedback from the customer, so that based on that feedback, the improving of client's response to feedback and suggestions, the final system is approved in the step 5. The step 6 is implement product and maintain. The final system is tested and distributed to production. Here the program is run regularly to prevent failures. So the program or the software is in execution in the implement and product and maintenance phase. What are the advantages of prototype model? So it reduces the risk of incorrect user requirement. The miniature model is demonstrated to the customer by taking feedback from the customer. Then only the refinement of the prototype must be done. After confirmation or phrasing of the requirement, then only the designing of the software must be conducted. Next, good where requirements are changing or uncommitted. Regular visible process aids management. So to track and controlling the project progress is very easy in case of prototype model. And support early product marketing, reduces maintenance cost. Errors can be detected much earlier as the system is made side by side. So these are the few advantages of prototype model. The disadvantages of prototype model are an unstable implemented prototype often becomes the final product. So quality must be compromised here and require extensive customer collaboration. So cost customer money, needs committed customers, difficult to finish if customer withdraw, maybe to customer specific, no broad market. So customer is greatly involved while evaluating and giving feedback. So it is mainly customer centric software development approach. Prototyping tools are very expensive. So these are the disadvantages of the prototype model. What are the applications of the prototype model? The prototyping model should be used when the requirements of the product are not clearly understood or unstable. At these real-time scenarios, the prototype model must be very useful. The prototyping model can also be used if the requirements are changing rapidly, and this model can be successful used for developing user interfaces, high technology software incentive systems, systems with complex algorithms and interfaces. The prototyping model is also a very good choice to demonstrate technical feasibility of the product. So the comparison of waterfall model and prototype model. So here in the waterfall model, user can only preview the system only after the final version of the software is developed because there is no feedback path. So here the waterfall model is a sequential approach from the analysis, design, coding, testing. So after testing only the product must be visible to the customer. But in case of prototype model, user have a preview of the system. Why? Because quick design phase is implemented in the prototype. So they can view the development of the process very early in case of prototype model. This is easy to understand. Complete program analysis. In case of waterfall model, it is simple. But in case it is not easy to understand the complete program analysis, the prototype is revising in an evolutionary approach. Waterfall model uses sequential approach, but the prototype model uses the evolutionary approach. Waterfall model is implemented in the prototype projects where conventional product software has to be delivered to the client. In such cases, user is sure and clear about his requirements. So if the user is clearly defined the requirements are frozen in the analysis phase of the waterfall model, then only it can proceed to the next phase of the development process, the designing process in case of waterfall model. But here whatever if the customer can have difficulty in defining the requirement, what requirement the customer specified, with that epic design must be implemented for the construction of prototype, and it is tested and evaluated by the customer through feedback, and the refinement must be done in the next version of the prototype. Works well for the small projects, the waterfall model, but the prototype model is good for both small and large scale project. Works well projects where requirements are well defined in the waterfall model. If the requirements are unstable and continually changing, then the prototype model is suitable. The spiral model. The next variety of process model is the spiral model. The spiral model initially proposed by Boehm, and it is an evolutionary software process model that couples the iterative feature of the prototyping with controlled and systematic aspects of the linear sequential model. Both approaches are combined in case of spiral model. The spiral model uses software is developed as a series of incremental releases. More clear functionality is defined as a series of increment or versions of the software. During the early iterations, the additional releases may be a paper model or a prototype model to gather the requirement very clearly. During later iterations, more and more complete versions of the engineered system are produced, and the progress is clearly visible to the customer. The features of the spiral model are: the exact number of phases need to develop the product can be varied by the project manager depending upon the project risk, as the project manager dynamically determines the number of phases, and it is the project manager plays an important role in developing the product using the spiral model. How many phases and how many iterations or how many increments the project can be decided by the project manager. So the skills of the project manager is greatly required for the spiral model of the software development. It is based on the idea of the spiral, with each iteration of the spiral representing a complete software development life cycle from requirement gathering, analysis, design, implementation, testing and maintenance. So this is the spiral model. So here for each iteration, consider this is the single iteration. In the each iteration, the major framework activities must be carried out, like a phased approach of analysis, design, coding, implementation and testing. And at the each beginning of each iteration, the risk must be assessed. So the risk driven approach is a spiral model. And here the prototyping can be done in order to gather the requirement more clearly from the customer. So during the early iterations, the risk management, risk assessment as well as prototyping approach can be used to quickly gather and freeze the requirement. Later, at the later increments, the software must be developed with the other phases of the sequential phases of the software development approach, the design, code, integration, testing, implementation can be planned. But at each evaluation, the cost must be the risk, and evaluation from the customer can be taken care, and the evaluation can be carried with the risk assessment as well as prototyping approaches. The product development can be done with the sequential approach of all phases of the waterfall model, and later the next phase or the next iteration must be planned, and this release must be reviewed, and the next object identification can be carried out by keeping in view of the cost of the development of the next iteration. How many iterations must be planned is depending upon the project manager expertise and skill. The phases of the spiral model are object setting. So the initial stage, each cycle of the spiral starts with identification of the purpose for the next cycle. So the various alternative that possible for achieving targets and constraints that exist. So risk assessment and reduction is the major feature of the spiral model. So the next phase of the life cycle is calculate the various alternatives based on the goals and constraints of the project. So the focus of evaluation is the stage is located on the risk perception of the project. The development and validation phase majorly use the development strategies that resolve uncertainties and the risk in the project requirements. This process may include activities such as benchmarking, simulation, and prototyping. The next phase of the spiral is the planning. So finally, the next phase is planned, the project is reviewed, and choice made whether to continue with a further period of the spiral by keeping in view of the cost analysis. If it is determined to keep, plans are drawn up for the next step of the project. So when this spiral model can be used means when deliverance is required to be frequent, when the project is very large and complex, when requirements are unclear and complex, when changes may require at any time the change in requirement by the customer is made and can be easily accommodated with the spiral model of the approach. Why the software must be released as a series of increments. Large and high budget projects are generally developed with the help of spiral model. The advantages of spiral model is high amount of risk analysis, useful for large and mission critical projects, majorly the real-time projects like reservation systems, healthcare systems, nuclear reactor maintenance systems. Those can be made with the help of spiral model. Change request in the requirement at a later phase can also be incorporated accurately by using this model, and customers can see the development of the product at the early phase of the software development and thus thereby habituated with the system by using it before completion of the total product. The disadvantages of the spiral model is it is very much depending on the risk analysis. So without very high experienced project manager or the expertise people, the risk assessment and next iteration planning could not be happen. And as the number of phases are unknown at the start of the project, time estimation is very difficult because the number of iterations are not fixed. The spiral model can be complex and it involves multiple iterations of the software development process. The spiral model can be time consuming and it can be resource incentive approach. So the differences between what is the traditional model, waterfall model, the spiral model, the prototype model by taking specific features. The first feature is requirement specification. The requirement specification done at the beginning in case of waterfall model, but in spiral model the frequently changed requirements must be taken into account, and at the prototype also during beginning itself the requirements can be frozen, then only the designing phase must be commenced. The complexity of the system is in the waterfall model it is simple, but in case of spiral model it is moderate. The prototype model, the complexity can be increased. The time schedules of waterfall model is very low, but spiral long. In case of prototype also it is long. The cost must be low in case of waterfall model, high and expensive in case of spiral and prototype model respectively. And documentation is clearly required for the waterfall model, and for the spiral and prototype model, documentation plays the major important role. The project size is suitable for waterfall model is large scale. Low or medium projects are for spiral. Large scale projects are for prototype model. The change of requirement accommodation can be difficult in case of waterfall model, but it should be easy in case of spiral and prototype model. The next model is the increment model. Increment model is a process of software development where requirements are divided into multiple standalone modules of the software development cycle. So in this model, each module goes through the requirement, design, implementation and testing phases. Every subsequent release of the module adds function to the previous release. So the process continues until complete system is achieved. So here the first simple increment or the module must be constructed with a sequential approach of requirement gathering, design, implementation and testing phases, and it is integrated with the next module or the next increment. So this must be evolutionary until the complete system must be completed. The features of the increment model is system development is divided into several smaller projects. To create a final complete system, partial systems are constructed one after the another. So priority requirements are addressed first, and the requirements for the increment are frozen once they are created. When to use this increment model is when the requirements are superior, a project has a lengthy development schedules, and when the software team are not very well skilled or trained, when the customer demands a quick release of the product, and you can develop prioritized requirements first in case of increment model. So this is the approach of the increment model. Here the software must be released as a series of increment over the calendar time. So during first increment, few functionality is demonstrated to the customer, but the increment construction can follow the waterfall approach like analysis phase, design phase, coding phase, testing phase. After taking feedback from the customer, the next more functionality is added for the increment 2, and it is following waterfall model approach for the construction and delivery of the project. So like this, the project is delivered as a series of increment. At a later increments, more functionality is delivered to the customer. So the phases of the increment model are requirement analysis. Majorly in this phase, the project objective, scope and what are the expectations from the customer must be gathered in case of requirement analysis phase. And the design and development phase involves the visual representation of the system with variety of designing diagrams, and when the software develops new practicality with the increment model uses style and development phases. Next approach is the testing implementation. The source code must be developed and can be tested clearly with the help of incremental model. So whatever increment that is developed is illustrated to the customer by taking the feedback. More additional functionality is added to the next increment. The advantages of this increment approach is prepares the software fast. Clients have a clear idea of the project. Changes are easy to implement. Provide risk handling support because of its iterations, and adjusting the criteria and scope is flexible and less costly. So comparing this model to others, it is less expensive. The identification of errors are simple. The disadvantages are a good team or proper planned execution are required for this type of approach. Because of its continuous iterations, the cost also increases. Issues may arise from the system design if all needs are not gathered upfront throughout the program life cycle. So every iteration step is distinct and does not flow into the next. So it takes a lot of time and effort to fix issues in one unit if it needs to be corrected in all other units. The comparison of various process models depending upon the waterfall model, increment model, prototype model, RAD model and spiral model by taking various parameters. So here the requirement specification is initial level at the waterfall model and at the increment model also initial level, and RAD model initial level, spiral model also initial level. But in the prototype model, it is at the middle level. And the feedback from the user is not taking in case of waterfall model, increment model, and RAD model and spiral model. But it must be considered in the prototype model, and quick design must be implemented in prototype model. And speed in change must be very less in case of waterfall model, and it must be high and medium in case of the next models. But the speed of change is not considered in case of RAD model. And the predictability must be very low in case of waterfall model, and it must be increment model, RAD model low, but in case of the prototype model and spiral model, it can be medium and high. So risk can be taken at initial stage in case of waterfall model, and the remaining three models it is not considered, but spiral model is clearly considered the risk assessment. So here preferable implementation is majorly not considered in waterfall model and RAD model, and low consideration in case of increment model, medium consideration in case of prototype and the spiral model. So here, so depending upon the various real-time situations, the model must be selected. So depending upon the cost of development, how these models must be compared. So the next model is the unified process model. So it is majorly concentrating on the object-oriented modeling. So here it recognizes importance of the customer communication, streamlined methods for describing customers' view of the system. So it emphasizes important role of software architecture and helps the architecture focus on the right goals such as understandability, reliance to the future changes and reuse. It suggests a process flow that is iterative, incremental, providing evolutionary feel that is essential in modern software development. So the features of the unified process model is use case driven. The communication plays the major role and clearly gather the requirement by using the variety of diagrams like use case diagram, sequence diagram. And the next feature is it is architecture centric defines the form of the system, how it should be structured with variety of diagrams like deployment diagram and component diagram. And the next feature is it is an iterative and incremental approach of development. So the general phases of the unified process are inception, elaboration, construction, transition. So they are generally the major framework activities based on the communication framework activity and planning activity majorly considered for the inception phase. The planning and modeling both can form the elaboration. Next, construction is development of the software or the source code, and this code must be tested and deployed in the transition phase. So it must be demonstrated to the customer in the production phase. So the main goal of inception phase involves delimiting the project scope. Elaboration involves development of functional requirement, finalizing the methodology. Construction phase is involved in the development of source code, integration and testing. Transition phase involves the deployment. The advantages are offering thorough documentation, enhancing risk management practices, giving regular feedback to stakeholders, reducing total project time, determining working elements early on in the project. The disadvantages are complexity of process, amount of documentation required, challenges of using it for the multiple development streams. And in this video, I clearly described about the prototype model, spiral model, increment model and unified model by comparing with other models the features. And these are the references used in this video. Thank you.
Like, share and subscribe. Hit the bell icon for more updates.